as the moderator mentioned, is to be science or not to be science, examination of Popper's falsifiability demarcation. And some of you guys are like looking at this and like have no idea what I'm talking about, so don't worry, this isn't going to be like 15 minutes of philosophical jargon. I'm going to try to like break things down and so it all makes sense to you. And if you have further questions, you can ask me at the end during the Q&A portion. All right, so first of all, what is philosophy? And some of you might already have like negative connotations of trying to read something and then like having no idea what this person is talking about. But philosophy is just a way of like trying to understand and make sense of the world. So a lot of philosophy starts out with questions like what is beauty, what is truth, what is like knowledge. And here I'm going to be examining what is science, and specifically what's the difference between science and pseudoscience. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about Karl Popper, who developed a demarcation criteria between science and pseudoscience. And by that I just mean, what criteria can we develop to distinguish between the two? So Karl Popper relies on deductive reasoning. He prefers that to inductive reasoning, which is what you see in a lot of philosophy of science. So here I have, kind of a breakdown of what deductive and inductive reasoning are. So deductive reasoning, you start with a universal statement, and then from that you compare it to particulars to see if that universal statement is true, or you use the statement to derive particulars. And with inductive reasoning, you develop your particular statements first, and then together they make up a universal. So what are universals and particulars? I'll go into this more in a later slide, but a universal statement is something like all men are mortal, applies to, or when you say all people are mortal, to be more politically correct, not to exclude women, we're also mortal as well. So all people are mortal. And then like a particular statement would be like Kathleen Springer is mortal. And so you could say, well, deductive reasoning would be like all people are mortal, Kathleen Springer is a person, therefore Kathleen Springer is mortal. And we're going to go into falsifiability. But like example of falsifiability would be like all people are mortal, for a hypothetical, Kathleen Springer is not mortal, therefore not all people are mortal. Inductive reasoning, you could use a bunch of examples, from history. Adolf Hitler is mortal, Benito Mussolini is mortal, John Springer is mortal, and then from getting enough evidence, you could say, oh well, then all people are mortal. The problem with inductive reasoning is that you're relying on so many particulars, and you never know if you have all the particulars. There are always going to be more people out there to study. And so it's like, well, what's the point? So it's like frustrating for, philosophers. Like they want to like understand, is this true or is this not true? So instead of using inductive reasons, let's start with the universal and then see if we can falsify it. So I've been kind of throwing out this word already. What is falsifiability? What is falsificationism? Falsifiability is, can this theory be proven or shown to be false? And then falsificationism is kind of like the process of, the idea that something can be falsified or not. I guess like an example would be like happyifiability. Like, does this make you happy? Then happyficationism, which would be like, just the idea that things can make you happy. So hopefully you understand that. Okay, so this is like a quintessential example that we hear a lot with regards to falsifiability. All swans are white, that's a theory. Then we see, oh, here's a black swan, and therefore not all swans are white. And there have been a number of books on, there's a really popular book out right now, it's called The Black Swan, talking about probability and that sort of thing. And so here we see, we have this theory, and then we have a premise, and the premise just falsifies the theory. Like, this theory is not true, it is false. And then we have a conclusion that reflects that. So applying this to science, an example of this could be like Newton's theory of gravitation. So we could say, in this room, we suppose there is gravity, that's our theory. So if I take, here, we're going to do this right now, science right before your eyes. I'm going to drop this paper, it's going to fall to the ground. That was our particular. The universal is all things in this room are going to fall due to the theory of gravity. And so we see, yes, the particular confirmed this theory, and if we got a premise where that didn't happen, then we would have falsified that theory. And that's kind of how we understand science. And You might think, well, isn't that how all science is? We falsify things. Well, no, there are pseudosciences that claim to be science. And one of those examples is Freud's theory of psychoanalysis. Now, people in general don't really like Freud. I mean, he was like on drugs. He was high when he wrote his theory. It talks about sexuality in a disturbing way. People, slept with some of his patients. Like, no one really likes Freud. Psychologists hate Freud. Studying psychology. We all have to mention Freud. He's the father of psychology, but no one likes him. But with regards to falsifiability, a key example that we use to show that Freud is pseudoscience. Like, we can show that Freud is pseudoscience, is not just some person we don't like, is through the ego defense mechanism. So Freud has, this idea of the self, which is the id, the ego, and the superego, which aren't really that important to the discussion, but the id operates on like the pleasure principle. It's our subliminal desires for aggression and sex, and the superego is like our conscience, and usually it's very legalistic, and it's what gives a bad feeling when we're about to do something wrong, and the ego kind of try to mediate between the two. However, Freud could present this theory of, you were raised this way, you had a horrible childhood, and therefore you are anal retentive, or, something really awful that people don't like. And someone could be like, no, this is not true. Like, none of this is true. None of what you're saying, Freud, makes sense remotely in my life. And then he could say, well, you're denying it. One of the classical ego defense mechanisms, you're just denying it. And so there's like really no way of showing that, Freud's theory of psychoanalysis is false for any particular patient. So that's why we would call it pseudoscience, according to Karl Popper's falsification, demarcation criteria between science and pseudoscience. However, while this might make sense initially, in my paper, I do some kind of philosophy where I criticize and I look into, well, does this actually make sense? Can we actually use falsificationism reliably to distinguish between science and pseudoscience? So to do so, I had to kind of unpeel the layers of some of the assumptions deeply embedded within falsificationism. And one of those is the reliance on universals. So as I explained previously, here are some universal statements, here are some particulars. Universals are true for, all whatever subjects, that is, all people throughout all time and all settings, although that can be modified. So I'd say all men are mortal or all people are mortal in America or something like that. Kathleen Springer is an American, therefore she is mortal. So, here, maybe it makes sense. This is kind of intuitive. That kind of makes sense. However, the problem is that science doesn't always rely on universals. And we see that particularly in my field, psychology. I'm a psychology major, not a philosophy major, but I love philosophy so much, and that's why I'm here. So Michael Cross writes specifically about this in his article, The Psychology of the Psychology Isn't a Science Argument. So I'm going to read a section of that for you guys here. Much of what bothers people about psychology is the sheer subjectivity of it all. That is, how we perceive any number of social phenomena is likely to vary a great deal from person to person. The problem is at the very core of psychological research, and many people feel that to be science, psychologists must uncover universal human psychological processes. The problem with this logic is that the search for human universals, with very few exceptions, is likely to be a fool's errand. Studying the human experience means asking people how they feel, and those feelings are likely to vary from person to person, situation to situation, and culture to culture. And so, the field of psychology itself is we're looking at people, and people are subjective, something I'll get into more later, with drugs, psychopharmacology, we can have these SSRIs that generally decrease depression, but then you have a bunch of case studies where they have the opposite effect. And use this in psychology all the time. We'll have this great theory, and then there'll be a case study. It's just all wrong, it's all messed up, and we're like, oh, what do we do? And we see this problem in psychology all the time. There was recently this replicability study. I think there was another presentation on this, but basically over half of psychological studies cannot be replicated. And some people say that's a problem with the method. They didn't explain the methodology well enough in the paper, but could also just well be this, is that people are very different. Our understanding of mental health can be shaped by sociological factors. It can be shaped by, their brain chemistry. Like, so many things go into psychology, and yet this is an important science. Like, the National Science Foundation, they give grants, for undergrads who do psychology. Some people like their social psychology, which is kind of like, it's kind of, you consider it like on the border between hard science and social science. But yet, psychology is an important science, and it doesn't follow this. We don't have that reliance on universals, that falsificationism just tends to assume. Another important criticism is that falsificationism assumes that people can gather data objectively, that they're able to recognize that, oh, this is an important data that falsifies this theory. And the thing is, people are subjective. And as a psychology major, I get this. There are so many things going on in this room right now. There's the lighting, there's the temperature, there's my voice. Maybe you have some internal thoughts going on in your head right now. Hopefully focus on the presentation. You're thinking about checking out and all that stuff for your hotel. But there are all these things going on, and you can only pay attention to so much. When you get into a pool for the first time, you're like, oh, it's kind of cold. But then you get used to it. You don't notice it. You literally stop noticing the temperature. So we see this all the time. And then we're training ourselves to recognize certain things. So suppose you're this seminar, this panel has just ended, and you're like, okay, where are we going next? And it's all loud and busy, and everyone's trying to find their room for the next panel or whatever. And then you hear some names thrown out, and then you hear your name. And you're like, what? You stop and you recognize that name, but you didn't recognize all these other names. So we're very subjective. We only pay attention to certain things. It's literally impossible to pay attention to everything. Another example, and this one comes from Chalmers, who's also a philosopher of science, and he says, suppose you have this theory about something in an X-ray. It has some certain pathological condition attached to it. You can look at the X-ray. I mean, if I look at the X-ray, I wouldn't really see that much. I haven't trained my eyes to recognize, well, this in an X-ray means this. And that's just you literally see things differently. After studying radiology and studying X-rays for decades, the radiologist is going to see something in there that medical student doesn't. And so it raises the question, so was it falsified? The medical student said, I don't see it there. So, the theory's been falsified. No, the radiologist comes in, sometime 5 minutes later, oh no, I do see something. Okay, it hasn't been falsified. It doesn't work for science. People are subjective. And so we're not going to be able to really recognize the data when we see it. The final criticism that I have is that it assumes that we have the ability to know the proper conditions and tools to test the theory. And that's, something you recognize when you're doing research in any field. You're designing this study, you're going to test this thing, you have this theory, a hypothesis, you're going to see if the data is consistent with that. But you don't know all the variables involved. You don't know if you're using the right equipment. Maybe the equipment is going to measure this and it measures something else. You see in psychopharmacology all the time. You test for, well, I think these drugs will interfere with these drugs, so we make sure you're not on these drugs, and then we're going to test you taking placebo or a particular psychopharmacological drug, and then maybe someone just took a run that day, and we didn't test for that, and then that run somehow elevated their metabolic rates, and now they take the drug differently. There's just so many factors involved with falsificationism that we're not able to really use that. I would argue we're not able to really use that to distinguish between science and pseudoscience. Unfortunately, I don't really have a solution for you guys here today, and that's kind of part of philosophy, is you wrestle with these ideas and you say, well, maybe it doesn't actually make sense comparing it to the real world. But, the thing with philosophy, you just get more questions and you get answers. Someone once said that, philosophy is, let me see if I can remember it. But religion is getting answers that can't be questioned, and philosophy is getting questions that can't be answered. And so that's kind of, how I see it. And so hopefully you guys are able to get an appreciation of philosophy of science, and be encouraged to think on your own examine theories and see if it's true with the real world. So that's like, you know, the most like fun thing I think in academics is being able to question, interact with the real world, and see that really things aren't as spirited as, you know,